Welcome to Environmental Coffee House tonight. I would love to see a whole lot of people join us because it's going to be a great conversation. Tonight we have, well, this is really Antonio's show, The Rising Tide. I'm Sandy Shellis. And our special guest, Nick Humphrey, meteorologist. We are going to talk about a couple of things. I wanted to, well, we were all talking and we decided that discussing the Jetstream would probably be kind of cool. This sinuosity and how it affects the weather and these patterns in the northern hemisphere. We're freezing, Australia's sweltering, you know, what's going on? And what about like ocean warming? It's been in the news so much lately. So there are quite a lot of things that are on the hemisphere for a good discussion. So welcome, Antonio, take it away.
All right, thank you, Sandy. So hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode. Of course, my segment is going to be on sinuosity, or what's going on with our jet stream. So the way I want to talk about this topic is first by referencing the kind of person who's kind of charting the pathway through all this, and that's Dr. Jennifer Francis at Rutgers University. Dr. Francis has been working on Arctic amplification, which signal that was first detected in the 1990s, actually in her doctorate program. So essentially what's happened, as Dr. Francis explains it, is that since about the 1990s, what we've seen is that there is an amplification process occurring in the Arctic. That is to say that the Arctic is warming much faster than other regions around the globe. And in fact, generally, when we see climate change happen, or warming episodes happen, global warming happen, we see the polar regions in general tend to warm faster, and the equatorial regions warm the least, or they warm slower than other regions around the world. So what ends up happening is the temperature gradient between the equatorial regions and the Arctic in particular begins to decline. Well, it's due to those temperature gradients that the jet stream has its strength and its stability, its form. So as the temperature gradient declines, the winds begin to weaken and they begin to elongate. That's what sinuosity is. Sinuosity is the measurement of the elongation occurring with the jet stream patterns. Now, Dr. Francis is very clear that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot more study that needs to be done, that, you know, when you're talking about something as variable as the atmosphere, you really can't say for certain if this is exactly the mechanism that we're seeing occur. But she does put some evidence forth, and one of the evidence that she puts forth is what we're seeing meteorologically. One of the examples that she uses is Hurricane Harvey. We saw Hurricane Harvey, a massive hurricane, swell up and get trapped over Houston for days at a time, allowing it to drop over 50 inches of rain. Well, that happened because the steering winds that would normally push hurricanes along were totally absent over the continental United States, allowing Harvey to essentially get stuck over land, dumping water in one area for multiple days. But also we see other things happen. The whole entire polar vortex phenomena, which I remember taking off really in 2013, 2014. It was a media sensation at the time, but that whole phenomena it gives its thanks to what's happening with the jet stream system. Essentially what happens is cold Arctic air is able to seep down into the mid-latitude regions, which can drastically change our weather. So one day we might be having weather in the 50s or the 60s, and then the next day genuinely having temperatures as high as 20 degrees or in and about. We've seen this affect our weather systems as far as heat waves, which, you know, obviously Nick Humphrey will talk a little bit more about that. But I did just want to kind of break into this new mechanism that's kind of under intense study by climatologists and specifically atmospheric scientists, people like Dr. Jennifer Francis. So Nick, if you want to pick up and maybe elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, so so you know, Francis discovered that basically starting in the 1990s, the Jetstream began to exhibit a weakening of its mean flow around the Earth in the northern hemisphere, and that waviness or sinuosity intensified going into the 2000s and now into the 2010s, and that process is thought theorized by her to be caused by the rapid and abrupt decline of Arctic sea ice. The sea ice was considered a semi-permanent feature in the Arctic Ocean, all year round. So even in the summer, you have some retreat of the sea ice, but it was enough that it basically maintains a sort of stable state to the climate system, to the ocean atmosphere system of the Arctic. However, because you've had a rapid retreat of sea ice seasonally since the 1980s, what happens is that you get a thinning of ice, greater retreat of ice, loss of volume, loss of extent, and greater ocean warming in the seas, outer seas of the Arctic Ocean. And that causes an amplification of the atmosphere in the Arctic in general, but that also reduces the temperature gradient. And that's throughout the layer of the atmosphere, so it reduces essentially the steepness of the atmosphere, because the way the atmosphere works between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes is that because the mid-latitudes are generally warmer than the Arctic, the atmosphere in the Arctic is actually compressed closer to the surface than it is in the mid-latitudes. So on any given plane, constant height, there's a pressure, decrease in pressure going from the mid-latitudes to the poles that creates a pressure gradient force, which, helps keep a strong jet stream. But if the Arctic is warming, the atmosphere is also expanding, climatologically getting, higher up. And as a result, that reduces the pressure gradient and the jet stream weakens and becomes more turbulent. And that turbulence can be locally enhanced by warming of the areas that were once covered in sea ice, such as the Barents Sea, the Bering Sea, Laptev seas. These outer seas, they spend so much time being warmed by the sun because they have no white ice cover to reflect sunlight back into space, that can make these upper level ridges, these poleward pointing areas of high pressure in the upper atmosphere, where the air flows north and then south on the other end, they get stronger, taller, bigger, more poleward, and then they stall out. They don't progress west to east as you see typically in a more normal weather pattern. And so as a result, you get these meteorologically extreme events where you get extreme heat or extreme cold or high precipitation downstream from these ridges, and the huge dipping troughs where you get colder air that seeps out of the Arctic. So you see these features occur in the wintertime and in the summertime. In the summertime, they can manifest as extreme heat events, heavy precipitation events on the other end of the scale. In the winter, they can manifest as abnormally warm temperatures to extreme cold barreling out of the Arctic, where that cold would many over the course of many years in the past would stay locked in the Arctic most of the time and most years.
So let me ask, how are meteorologists and climatologists able to differentiate when we see this type of jet stream manipulation, when we see more natural weather patterns like synoptically mediated heat waves in the summer that occur, for example, in the boreal forests in the high Canadian North?
Sometimes it can be hard to differentiate, whether an event is, for sure related to, essentially climate change or not. What differentiates many times is the extreme nature of the event, and our understanding of whether this, how frequently to occur, and based on the conditions we know have changed because of climate change, much more likely was this event because of climate change, and that's, it's an ongoing process because, people want to understand just how frequently, or just how much attribution there is to these events because of climate change. But that's always a hard thing to know, in real time. I always remind people the more important issue is the accumulative effect of a combination of natural variability events and the events that are truly extreme becoming more frequent. It basically loads up, on your natural systems and on your systems of civilization. So, whereas, in pre-industrial times, maybe you have, a heat wave where the temperatures would go, into the mid to upper 90s for a few days here or there. You could handle it. But then as a result of climate change, you're getting more of those events that you're more typical, but you're also getting these crazy extremes where the temperatures rise to the mid 100s, where you never had those kind of temperatures before. And the combination of all of those events loading up on each other causes more drought conditions, more fires. So it's climate change it's important to understand the processes that, to the best of our ability, how they're affecting individual events. And they're getting, scientists are getting better at those, at detection of climate change attribution, as we've seen from some of the recent hurricanes like Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Florence, and the heat waves. The heat waves are actually the easiest to attribute because they're directly related to global warming. But it's really a load up of events that are both familiar to us from the previous climate and then those that are coming up that are adding to, or an additive effect. And unfortunately, it's not an additive effect in terms of the impacts. The impacts a lot of times are nonlinear. You hit a certain tipping point and you start getting a lot of heat-related deaths, or a lot of cold-related deaths, or accidents, or a lot of things that suddenly weren't a big deal suddenly become a huge deal very, very quickly.
Such as the deaths of the animals in Australia from drought and heat, and they came upon the horses, and all of these things, but are not being connected. I'm going to ask a question about, since you're talking about this, I guess it's like a weather whiplash. The frequency of the change in temperature, how it could go where I live to -7 degrees Fahrenheit, and then within 24 hours it was 42 degrees. And when you talk to people, they're like, "Oh, this has happened before," But I'd like to talk on that a little. And I do want to say one more thing. We have a lot of questions tonight too, which are going to be fun to go through. So I'm going to let you go on that one.
Yeah, on that. This is an interesting question because it is something that I don't know if it's actually been researched enough. Because the research of Jennifer Francis is actually still fairly new. I mean, she's been dealing with it for herself for a few decades now, but the acceptance that climate change and Arctic amplification is actually causing extremes, both heat extremes and cold extremes, and rapid swings between them to intensify in the mid-latitudes is not something that actually is still being widely accepted by a lot of scientists yet, which is kind of surprising because just as a meteorologist that understands jet stream dynamics, it seems fairly simple concept, but it's something that I've noticed is not being widely accepted. Because here's the thing, like when you talk about these swings in individual weather events, I can point to examples in the past where such huge swings have happened. But the question is, are those swings happening more frequently? Climate change is not just about new extremes, but it's about the old extremes sometimes becoming less frequent, or many times becoming more frequent or greater in magnitude. And I've seen all sorts of weird stuff myself in the past year and a half. I remember last April here in Lincoln, Nebraska, we had a powerful system come through the plains. April was the third coldest April on record, going back to 1887. We had a day where the temperature shot up to 82 degrees. And then 24 hours later, the Arctic air came in, it was 32 degrees and snowing. I couldn't believe it. I think it was the most extreme swing in temperature I'd ever seen outside of going up in altitude, up 14,000 feet up a mountain from Denver or something. It was incredible. Those kind of things you've seen on the plains before, going back 100, 200 years, people have reported those kind of crazy events. But is the jet stream circulation changes actually causing, these swings, these wild swings in temperature to occur more frequently? I'm not sure if that's been established very well yet. The only things I notice are some of the a couple of things that I'm noticing is snow cover. I know there's research showing that snow cover in the northern hemisphere, there's actually more snow starting to fall and accumulate. And part of that may be because the atmosphere is taking in more moisture as the climate warms, but the melting season for snow in the northern hemisphere is occurring earlier. So you're getting more snow, but you're all, from snowstorms, winter storms, but then global warming, mean warming is making it such that seasonally it's melting earlier. Another thing I noticed this fall, going into meteorological winter, which starts December 1st into the end of this past year, is that the soil temperatures were not cooling. We had abnormally cold October, and then part of November going into much of December was very warm, and then we started getting a little cold again, and that got very warm in early January. Now we're getting very cold weather in the remainder of January. The soils here typically start to fall below freezing, in December, and they did not fall below freezing. And throughout much of the Central Plains, going into parts of the Northern Plains, because it just wasn't persistently cold enough to allow soils to fall below freezing. And soil, and the thing with soil is that when you fall below freezing, it hardens, it tightens up, and that's something that is important for agriculture in the springtime, because it allows for the planting process to be done. But as long as it starts to warm up when it's supposed to warm up, but if it's not freezing, then you end up with a lot of mushy soil, too much water in the layer of the soil. And I heard people talking about how bad it could be in the spring as far as spring planting if you don't have persistent freeze season, in addition to the proper warming. Last year we had a similar problem where you had issues with freezing, and then it got really cold late in it's winter into the spring in Nebraska, Iowa. They had to delay planting in Iowa, and then May it got super hot. Even though I can't establish any one place is having more wild swings in temperatures. I know that something is going on at least the regional level, because processes that require persistence, persistent cold, persistent warmth for growing, for freezing, they're not functioning like they're supposed to, because the temperatures are swinging so wildly from these individual meteorological events. And like I said, it adds up. and it adds up to not having proper freezing, proper growing, and what you need to depend on for your agriculture and other things, or for water for that matter. If you're going out west, having water storage from snowpack.
That's an issue. Antonio, I want to ask you a question about this. What do you think and your thoughts on the variability and the what's going on, how hot it is in Australia and how cold it is?
I think what we're seeing is more properly described as climate instability. I think climate change, something that's changing, anything that's going through a transitionary phase is in a stage that is more unstable than when it's in one phase or the other. So what's happening is that our climate system is rapidly destabilizing. Just to give you a short, brief explanation of my own experience in the last couple of months here in North Carolina, we've been hit with record rain, record storms. We had 400+ year storms hit us within 4 months. We had Hurricane Florence, we had Hurricane Michael, and then we had a super snowstorm that where I live, Kernersville, North Carolina, we had 12 inches of snow in one day. That's never happened it's never happened in my life. And then, surprisingly enough, it was 70 degrees New Year's, which blew through all of our records. So we were literally going up and down on a roller coaster ride. And now we got down in the teens just a couple days ago, and we're rocketing back up to the 50s. So it's been destabilized here. But what about what's happening in Australia? We've seen things like this happen in Australia before, last year, because these things are increasingly new, where bats were literally in mid-flight. Their brains would literally boil and they would come crashing down out of the sky. I mean, if you want to understand how bad things are getting, look at how nature is responding to what's happening. If you start to see animals that had evolved in these environments for tens of thousands of years suddenly dying en masse, you know that we are in a catastrophic climate transition. And I just wanted to make a comment about some of the things that we've seen with arthropods and other insects. There's been several studies released about this just recently. One of the studies came out of Germany, where they were looking at specifically the biomass of flying insects in protected forest areas. So these were areas that are meant to preserve ecology to the best of our ability, given regulations, land use, and other things. And what they found is devastating. From 1989 to 2016, they saw a 75% reduction in the total biomass of flying insects in the area. 2018, just a year later, a paper came out saying that they were seeing anything between 60 to 90% biomass reproduction of insects in the rainforest in Puerto Rico. So this is serious. I think it's certainly a global thing. Like I say, when I went up to New York to visit Sandy Chalice in Angelica, New York, during the summer, I had to drive through North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And I came back and there may have been just a handful of bug splats on my car from driving that many states.
That's a popular topic. And I'm telling you, who is talking about it right now? Steve just said, flying insects are done. The comment section is buzzing. I get it. Okay.
Well, if the projection, if we continue on this trajectory, at least if we can extrapolate what's happening in Germany out to the rest of the world, I don't think there's much reason why we can't. We're really looking at something like 0% flying insect biomass between 2025 2030 at the current rate. I mean, this is truly alarming. And what the authors found out in the study is that what we're looking at wasn't necessarily linked to the use of pesticides. that the biggest variable in all of the case studies was temperature change. Climate change is essentially what's causing this great extinction, which I think is much worse than chemicals were, right? It would be difficult, but surely we could pass policies overnight that could have some effect on changing that if it was chemical based from pesticides. But the idea that it's climate induced, and everyone now knows that we are, we're ricocheting between 0.8 to 1.2 degrees Celsius above 1880, and we have at least another degree, or at least another half a degree in the pipeline. So we're really crossing dangerous thresholds for the stability of global ecology.
Yeah, and I mean it's the to speak about instability, that's really the kicker when you're dealing with climate systems, is that the climate system isn't just the atmosphere, it's the atmosphere, the ocean, the cryosphere, the land, the biosphere that inhabits the land and oceans. So when you, unfortunately, when you mess with one process, it can affect other parts of the system and cascading effects through the system. And it can do so in sudden and nonlinear ways that are difficult to predict. In the atmosphere, the jet stream is a big one. It pretty much, pretty much has done most of its impacts, most of its changes in just the past 15, 20 years. Even though we've had rising temperatures for a while now, it just kind of hit a tipping point with the sea ice and Arctic amplification. Suddenly the jet stream started going wild. Insects, we don't really know perhaps when the decline in the insects really started to accelerate, but it's gone faster and faster in the past, probably in the past 30 years, since it started getting warmer throughout the world in the 1980s. You look at, all in, and it doesn't even include things such as environmental destruction and other things going on just from the growth of humanity. That adds on even more. It's the warming of the planet, and then on top of it, you add in these chaotic phenomenon with the oceans and ocean heat waves and jet stream problems in both hemispheres. There's different things going on in the southern hemisphere, but you're still getting these, monster heat waves that, suddenly start killing creatures that can handle it up to a point, and then there's a tipping point, basically their biological ability to biologically respond to it, and then they start dying in mass.
Like the flying foxes.
Like the flying foxes. I think it was about, they started encountering heat of about 42 Celsius, which is about 108.
Oh,
yeah, something like that. Yeah. And they started just, dropping like flies, which is, usually a figure of speech, but the flies are probably dropping too.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I mean, it's, and I heard about some more flying foxes, another species of bat that suffered some thousands of deaths a few days ago in Australia. So, I mean, the heat, it's easy for people to ignore things when you have all this technology. You can just run in your house and stay cool. But when you see the environment around you beginning to basically just die, then you know something is very different from the way it was in the past.
And this is where deep adaptation comes in, the type of thing that Jem Bendel is talking about. I don't know if this was not planned. I just popped at the top of my head about the fact that Mindy earlier had talked. She had a question in the comment section. Well, it wasn't a question. It was a comment about preparing, and we have to prepare for, or the children have to prepare. I'm not going to be around to see a lot of it. I mean, I'm seeing it, but it's for what we do for education for children. And we also have someone with us tonight, AB Lukman from Coffee and Current Events with Lukman Nation. And they are really my buddies. I spent time with them in DC, and they're wonderful people. So he was saying that this was one I wanted to put up. He said, most people I talk to instinctively know that something is up with the weather, but there's hardly a mention of it on mainstream media. And thank you, AB, for that. Antonio, can you first maybe address that one?
I think, so I come from a background of mass violence and societal suicide. I look at the work of someone like Amitash Ghosh, who is an Indian writer who writes The Great Derangement. I look at the works of people like Noam Chomsky on manufacturing consent, and that's how I understand really how the media operates in our society, okay? So right now we have, and I don't want to focus on Fox News in this analysis. I think they are a phenomenon in of themselves. I want to focus on things like MSNBC, CNN, the so-called liberal news networks, purportedly the networks that would be most interested in the climate change agenda. Well, I think why, in part, climate change doesn't get the media attention it deserves is because of, well, there's several factors. One of the factors is that it's not really acknowledged by either of the political parties, okay? So in a lot of ways, if you're in the Beltway, that's the area between Washington and New York, whatever isn't in the Beltway, you just don't report on. So that sense of objectivity is very defined by its geographical space. So if the people in the Beltway are speaking about climate change, then we're reporting about climate change. If they're not speaking about climate change, then we're not reporting about climate change. So you have that factor. Secondly, climate change is a problem that really fundamentally challenged every aspect of our etiological understanding of the development of our civilization. What do I mean by that? Climate change asks us to do something at a moment, I think, in neoliberal era, we're most vulnerable, and that is to collectively respond. What is our collective action going to be in the face of a collective problem? Neoliberalism has disarmed us of these values. So as a nation, as a society, and because the West is leading the way on the international scene, we've kind of framed the entire argument under what individual countries are going to do and individual efforts that will come out together to have some type of macro response, but they're all going to be doing this individually. There's not a lot of nation-to-nation cooperation in trying to achieve these so-called climate goals. So, well, China, they'll do what they can do. The U.S. will do what they can do. France can do what it does, and then we'll hope at the end of the day that it will meet the mark that we want. And right now, we're going to overshoot for doing things like that. So I think the media ultimately doesn't cover it because look at who advertises for the media. Okay. The people who advertise for the media are the same people who control, really, I think, the negotiations of the Paris Accord, and that's the oil companies. The military, which is the #1 consumer fossil fuels other than the United States. I mean, look, and just think about that alone. Even if the United States was to go carbon neutral, we have a huge military force that requires unlimited fossil fuels at the ready for its mobilization projects around the world, maintaining its military bases of that nature. I mean, this idea is one of the issues we're facing at my school, and again, why the media doesn't want to cover this. It's also very grim, and you lose people's attention with how grim this is. But even at my school, for example, and we're going to see this on the national scene when all of us get scared and serious about this, is there's going to be an effort to move toward climate neutrality and things of that nature. But what you're going to find is, first off, We have infrastructure in the ground right now that has a life cycle of 30, 40, 50 years, and we put millions and millions of dollars into that infrastructure. So nobody wants to have their assets stranded, not just oil companies, but also civilians and utility companies. Okay. The next thing we're going to find is, are you going to be able to convert things like natural gas powered steam back generators that warm huge spaces for institutions and workspaces with solar power and wind on an intermittent level? God, no. So when people find this out, there's going to be a sense, at least on the intellectuals who are able to think about this, that, oh, wow, we're kind of in a bind, because it wasn't like all we had to do is flip the light switch at some point in the future, and we're just delaying flipping the light switch. Switching civilization from fossil fuel to non-fossil fuel, a lot of people are now going to be, we're in this phase where we're going to be on fossil fuels for a long time. Things are going to get, regardless of the scenario. So worst case, best case scenario, the climate's going to change, okay? 1.5, 2 degrees, even if that was all that we were going to get. What that would mean for every living human being, for them in practical terms, is that their climate systems would become more and more and more destabilized for the rest of their lives. That's all they would know. But that's true on any case scenario. Any level of more warmth than what we're currently experiencing is going to make the situation worse. And so for us, it's only going to appear that way. That is not something that the media can cover, you know. So in a lot of ways, we have institutional reasons why the media doesn't want to cover climate change. We don't want to get our advertisers upset. There are profound, deep psychological reasons that have been entrenched by our culture of what I call unwarranted optimism and consumerism and distraction circus. Christopher Hitchens writes about in his Empire Illusion. Well, those effects have really crippled us in a lot of ways. So we won't see mainstream outlets cover the climate crisis. And I even think on independent media, we see some coverage, but it's really mild coverage compared to what's actually happening around the world. I mean, I'm talking about the real news. I'm talking about Amy Goodin's Democracy Now! I'm talking about Jimmy Dore's show, The Young Turks. They talk about the issue. They mention the issue. But if this is a crisis that's going to possibly collapse civilization in the next 20 years and end the species' ability to survive this century, you would think we'd get a lot more coverage than what the so-called progressive networks are doing as well.
Well, what do you think about that, Nicholas, in just to segue, since you're a meteorologist and you're talking, Antonio, you're talking like the big picture of all of them. And I would like to hear what Nicholas has to say about his, well, the ones that are on television, the meteorologists that talk about these storms, and they never mention any of the, you know, why they're happening, just that, oh, we're going to get this. What's your take on that?
Some of it, and you know, this is an issue. Some of it is, you know, politics, and not just the politics of necessarily the viewing area, but you know, that can affect the discussion of climate change in the news and local news, because really that's what a lot of people pay attention is their local news. But it can also be editors, news editors. It can also be the individual. You know, TV meteorologists are very different from, say, the profession. You know, as professionals and say the professional researchers that, you know, that spend a lot of time delving into the details and doing, you know, research stuff and everything else. And so, you know, because of that, there are a lot more. I don't know if the numbers have changed more recently. hope so, but I know in just the past several years, I've seen surveys showing that over a third of TV meteorologists don't believe in climate change is caused by humans. I know of some prominent meteorologists that I'll keep unnamed, but are quite well known, that don't accept it, the science of it. Some of them are older. Sometimes the older generation has more of a bias toward normalcy bias. But I've noted that that there isn't really a lot of discussion or connection of climate change to the phenomenon of what is happening with actual weather, and unfortunately, because of that, and some of that might be because the meteorologists don't always know the latest research or know what's going on. They don't communicate that connection to people, or they're told not to, and therefore people don't necessarily learn about it, even though they may know something is up with the weather. I mean, how many people are really going to understand the potential climate change connection between the cold waves that we've seen in the past, say in Europe and in North phenomena and climate change, because everyone thinks of climate change as being warming, and a lot of meteorologists will say, we'll just talk about the global warming aspect, and some climatologists I've heard, like, every time there's a cold wave, you hear skeptics go, "Oh, well, it's cold, it's not global warming," and meteorologists sometimes have to say, "No, it's local cooling, local events, but the globe is still warming and still well above in terms of temperature, what it used to be." But a lot of people don't necessarily grasp that some of those, even those cold waves, have a connection to what's going on, and that may be the verbiage. Climate change isn't just about global warming; it is about a destabilization, instability in terms of what's going on with climate patterns. And I know that some scientists have tried to communicate this, like I know James Lovelock, Dr. Lovelock from England. He actually did some modeling to try to take into account some of the feedback processes that may accelerate climate change. And a lot of what he found was that instead of having this relatively linear or even continuous, quasi-exponential change, you may have events where you have a lot of instability going on, and then suddenly, over a course of years, you get a huge shift in global temperature, huge rise in global temperature, and other shifts in atmospheric circulations in a very short time, and then it stabilizes again. So in other words, you're getting tipping points that instead of just accelerating something, you get almost a super exponential discontinuous shift where you go abruptly from one state to another state. Wow. Very, very rapidly. And, people don't really grasp that because nobody tells them that, it's not communicated to them, that it's not just about the planet getting warmer, it's about the things that you count on not being there when you expect them, because the weather itself, the thing that affects you on a day-to-day basis, is becoming more unstable, and you don't know what to expect when you expect it to be happening seasonally over time.
I have a comment here I want to read from LaDonna Robertson, and it kind of encapsulates this whole thing. As we live here in Tacoma, Washington, next to an active volcano, the big one, earthquake, a PSE fossil fuel LNG plant explosion in the blast zone, and a possible tsunami, quote, "what me worry," unquote, Ad Magazine, Alfred E. Newman. It is very expensive, even moving to a small distance where it is relatively safe. Where is it relatively safe with climate change? Thank you, LaDonna. I thought that was great segue into something to talk about next. Like, where is it? Where is it safe? And you want to answer to that to start, Antonio?
Where is it safe to move for climate change?
Oh, the guys are laughing.
The idea that there's going to be somewhere safe, I think, is kind of a misnomer. What's happening is the entire system is now under a state of change, and it will be going through a state of change for thousands, if not tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of years now. We are at the precipice of monumental Herculean planetary change. That's if we go to 1 degree Celsius in a century, 2 degrees Celsius, and we're headed toward 5 or 6. So I don't know what it means. In terms for human ability to survive, I don't know what that means, because it's not as if right now, the way I describe it is right now the entire biosphere is in a state of shock. You know, animals are swimming further north to escape the warming seas. Animals are flying higher. Flora and fauna are moving in every direction to try to respond to the ongoing climate change that's occurring. But of course, climate change is happening on a pace that is hundreds or thousands of times faster than the natural rate of evolution. So essentially, we are stepping into a process of there's no safe place to go. There's no safe place to go. That's all I guess I have to say is there's no safe place to go.
Well, I have that conversation with my daughter, and she'll say, well, you know, we're looking at this place. Maybe we want to go. And they live in Buffalo. And I said, don't go south. I tell her, don't go south. I mean, that's just
your biggest danger in a runaway climate system is not going to be the weather itself and the extremities that come from that. And they will be there full out and fledged. The diseases will be there. All of that will be there, but the biggest danger will be your neighbor. The biggest danger will be your own family. The biggest danger is the next walking Homo sapien looking for food. So if you want to think about safety in those terms, get away from populated areas.
Yeah, as to answer this question, you know, obviously there is no safe place from climate change. I mean, to answer that question, I'm originally from Seattle, you know, so I was born there in '84, lived there continuously, minus a stint at another university in Washington State. I was there until 2008, and I was, you know, there for a summer in 2009. So, I've lived on the plains, you know, continuously since 2009. So I lived there, and I watched the real beginnings of like the perceptible climate change in that area. Like I remember in the 1990s and late 80s, you know, you'd have cool weather until maybe July, and then it gets warm. You'd have some 90-degree days, not very many. We had one 100-degree day. It was an all-time record in 1994. I remember it because it was extremely hot, hottest temperature I'd ever experienced up to that point. And then we broke that record and went up to 103 in 2009. And that was an extremely hot summer. And little did anybody know that was probably the beginning of the heat era for Seattle, because going into the 2000s, the region, Western Washington, Eastern Oregon, or Western Oregon, have just gotten dramatically hotter. More fires, more heat waves, more 100-degree days. Fires so extreme in Western Washington, Western Oregon, British Columbia, that there's like thick smog of of ash and ash falling out of the sky and sea. I never seen anything like that when I was growing up there. I'm only 34 years old, you know, and to see such dramatic changes. And that's a place people would think would be safer from climate change because you come to the interior of the continent, you're going to, you know, get blasted by wild extremes in heat and temperature and precipitation, tornadoes. But you look at the Pacific Northwest, I mean, it's extraordinary what's happened in just 10 years.
It's also happening, and I just saw there were big fires in Costa Rica. So, I mean, it's every continent it's touching. We're just, because we live in the United States.
So, I mean, to answer the question, you know, say there's no safety because the changes are always devastating in every different place. They're just the different kinds of devastation. You go out west, it's fires. You come here, it's, you know, really starting up in the past few years. It's crazy heat that could cause crops to suffer here, you know, in the breadbasket of the United States. I know farmers are starting to feel the effects of climate change, regardless of their political viewpoints. You know, they see it. They're the ones that grow the plants. You know, they're the experts, and they see the effects of it. And you know, my biggest fear is that, you know, next year, the year after, you know, it's inevitable. There's going to be something akin to what's happened in Europe with crop failures, you know, because of heat stress and drought on the plants. There's just no escape. You know, you go up north, it's not as hot, but your permafrost is melting, releasing mercury and destroying your infrastructure, and there's no escape.
AB had a comment. Wait a minute, this is a different one. I want to find. Oh, here it is. The warming of the oceans frighten me more than anything because of the impacts on our survival on the planet, and the problem of food insecurity that the loss of marine life would present too. So we're really in a lot of different quagmire.
The ocean warming is really I don't know if people really comprehend how bad that is, because you know, I know the IPCC says, you know, we're only looking at another 0.5 or 0.6 degrees Celsius globally baked in and everything based on the current emissions. But the reality is that you have long-term changes that will make it that are baked in. It'll make it a lot warmer than that with the amount of CO2 and methane that's already in the atmosphere. And the warming of the oceans also means it could cause much more dramatic tipping point effects that could produce climate, chaotic climate instability that's far, far worse than what we're dealing with right now. So warming ocean, it eventually kills life that can't handle the heat. Kills coral. Coral could go extinct. Destroys the food chain that depended on the coral reefs. Causes melting of the glaciers that sit on bedrock along Greenland, and particularly along Antarctica, the shores of Antarctica, causing incredible acceleration of sea level rise. I mean, the rise in sea level right now, if you take it on an exponential curve, is multiple meters this century. Not in hundreds of years. I mean, it's absolutely devastating beyond belief, and it'll creep up on people very, very quickly when suddenly their homes flood, and then the flood doesn't stop.
Antonio, do you have anything to offer for that one? Because I know that's also one of your and Nicholas, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to ask Antonio to comment on it.
Well, I mean, it's to look at this from multiple angles. One thing I was just thinking about was this whole issue of sea level rise that almost no one talks about, as far as as one of the, well, I guess people talk about it, they don't really understand the implications of sea level rise. I mean, the idea, I mean, so as we know, there's a couple of things. The ocean takes more energy to warm up. That energy causes the oceans to expand, which is causing them to rise. So this whole issue, to me, is really magnificent. I think what's happening in the ocean is, in a lot of ways, much scarier than what's happening on the surface. Mainly because, first of all, the ocean is 75% of our planet, whereas land surface area is only 25%. So it's really a water world after all. The heat waves that we see in the ocean are a lot more challenging, a lot more widespread and intense than the heat waves we see on land. The heat that the ocean's taking up, first of all, people have to understand, and this is a part that I think a lot of people just have difficulties wrestling with, but there's about a 30-year inertia, thermal inertia that's driven by the oceans. So that means when you put emissions into the atmosphere, we don't feel them right away. It takes decades for us to feel the effect of those emissions. Well, the vast majority of emissions have been released since 1985. Okay, so that means that we have a colossal amount of heat that's still in the pipelines that our oceans are going to release at some point. This is where so what that means is that you hit the point of catastrophe before you hit the point of catastrophe. I think the inertia cycle is about 30 years. That means we would have crossed the point of catastrophe or committing ourselves to catastrophe in the year 2000, which happens to correspond to when the year the Kyoto protocols were put together, or failed, I should say. So Paris is 15 years after that. For 15 years committed into this sort of catastrophe. The oceans, like I say, they're slowly, well, not so slowly, but in human scales, it seems like it's slow, are rising. One thing we learned from Hurricane Harvey is when you submerge industrial societies, they explode. And it's not just the nuclear facilities, and the nuclear facilities are huge, but it's also the heavy industrial facilities as well, the chemical plants and processors that go under. A lot of these machines are built, or these huge colossal buildings are built under the scenario that they would never have to be shut down or turned off or turned back on. And so they're meant to operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with very little interruptions and certainly with no disruptions. You know, one of the cases we saw in Harvey was that first responders were 2-3 miles out from the site where the chemical explosions were going on, and when they stepped out of their vehicle, they had bloodshot eyes. They were choking. I mean, this is going to be situations. Right now, I was just looking at a report from the BBC talking about how real estate prices are starting to go down across the eastern seaboard, particularly in places like Maine. So people are becoming more and more aware. Our markets are becoming more and more aware of what's going on. And we are looking at a situation where the sea will become our enemy. Like Nick Humphrey said, the interior of the continent is basically going back to Dust Bowl. So people will be choked out of the interior of the continent. The coast will be submerged. And then we'll have these extreme weather extremes and fires happening in the north, and people will be fleeing the south from wet bulb temperature. And this is really what the world looks like crossing 2 degrees. A world that's 3 degrees is really a type of nightmare that Homo sapiens really would ought to avoid if we had any sense about us. But of course, the Paris Accords, which people hail as some type of promise for the future, is in my view, is a global suicide pact where countries commit to 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, which of course you can't commit to 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. If you even go in that direction, you'll overshoot and head to hothouse.
Guys, we've been on for about an hour, and there are some really good questions and comments all, in this section. So in the interest of time, I'd like to read maybe a couple more to you.
Sure.
And
Sure.
we can respond, because this is going really well this way. I'm enjoying this a lot. So I want to put up Heidi. It's a kind of a lengthy one, but the question is good. Okay. Heidi's major concern is that, along with the Town Council of Tacoma, the Town Council in control of the CPV, Competitive Power Ventures frack gas facility in the tribal territory in Hudson Valley, New York, which I've been, I know the people that are activists there. Their city councilors have been bought out and corrupted by the fossil fuel industries to give them the green light to start up these horrific frack gas facilities and cause more climate change devastation. So what can we do to help stop such corruption? The politicians need to be held accountable. How do we do that? Are there any laws to help defend our planet? And which one of you would like to try to take a stab at that?
You can go first.
Okay. Well, I don't know any laws particularly that you can use to defend yourself in these type of cases. I'm sure there are. You'll have to contact an attorney or something like that to look into that. What I believe that we have to do, from my understanding and my study of history, is engage in mass civil disobedience. We're going to have to actually start putting our bodies out there to get the type of change that we want. The institutions, the companies, our political institutions are not going to change unless we force them to at this point. I mean, we just saw from the Trump administration, its own highway patrol, safety patrol or whatever, released a report saying the world was going to warm by 7 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, which is devastating. And they gave that as a reason not to control emissions, for God's sakes. So if we want any type of change, it's because we're going to mobilize people to really start causing civil disobedience. And I do mean blocking highways. I do mean blocking banks. I do mean boycotts. I mean, I really do mean, in a lot of ways, getting into acts of property. I mean, you know, in the United States and the West, we're so, you know, basically I'm almost putting a criminal charge against me by saying that we have to engage in property destruction in the United States. And this is a country that kills children in its drone program. And I should be afraid to say that we shouldn't break some oil company property. Of course, we're going to have to do that. And they're preparing for that. That's why ExxonMobil is the former Secretary of State. The oil companies know that people are going to eventually realize that the climate is getting out of control, and that directly threatens them. And they know who's behind them: ExxonMobil, Shell, BP. And people are going to be increasingly aware of the propaganda campaign. And what they're going to do is they're going to realize, like in the North Dakota Access Pipeline, where we had the United States military, missionaries, the local police force, and local governance working together with the corporation to spy on protesters, to surveil protesters' phone data, put drones in the sky, give them coordinates. Just like we saw all that, that's going to happen. That's going to be unleashed during this moment of climate chaos that we're all headed toward. So they're preparing for us to start mobilization projects. I say, let's start the mobilization projects. Let's give them hell, because they brought hell to our world. So in a lot of ways, we're going to have to carry out the mission and legacy of people like Martin Luther King. We're going to have to start uniting people. And it's everything. It's everything. Push them on everything. Push them on the 70% tax rate. Push them on Medicare for all. Push them on ending the drone war. Call them out for being murderous liars in Venezuela. We see that happening today. Call them out for what's happening in Yemen. Call them out for what's happening in Libya. And we see that there are people around the world starting to call them out. The Yellow Vests in France. We see the Extinction Rebellion groups popping up. We see the Greece pushing back against the austerity of neoliberalism. So we do see people in struggles. We see in the Amazon, we see Native communities suing ExxonMobil and other oil extractors. But it is a fight, and we all have to be engaged, each and every one of us.
Alvin says, we are dependent on the things we complain about. Yeah. Well, you know,
Yeah.
I think about that very often. We're dependent because that's what we've been given. We've never had a choice on anything else. 40 years ago, when we knew, right? We weren't given a choice. We weren't told.
I think a lot of the activism that will come up from people realizing the effects of climate change will probably come up because of the effects of climate change itself. So you may not always see protesters dealing directly with climate change, but you may see, if the economy in the West, in the United States, starts to falter or just plain fall apart because of the pressures of the limits to resource growth and climate change effects, such as extreme heat, people dying and unable to afford food because of food insecurity, and things that we're so used to seeing in the developing world, and in some cases because of the abuses of power and resources and political problems that the West causes in a lot of these places. We start to see those effects here, then people will start to wake up. I think the thing with a lot of folks, in at least the United States and perhaps in other affluent countries, is that they don't touch problems that aren't directly affecting them in a lot of cases. And there's going to be a point much sooner rather than later when you're going to have a lot of people that are going to be unemployed, not having enough money for food. The shelves are going to be, and the grocery stores are going to be becoming less and less. Water is going to become a problem. It already is in the Southwest U.S. You're going to have a lot of problems people aren't used to, and suddenly they're going to have to start caring because their lives are at stake. And I don't know if it's already too late to do anything about it. To actually stop what we've already done. Probably not, based on all the evidence. But people just people are going to try to survive, and they're going to be angry if somebody or an institution or a government has caused them harm by not informing them of the dangers in a way that they really needed to do so, and have been colluding with the super rich to basically suck them dry. They get rich while everybody else basically suffers or burns up, or their cities burn to the ground because of fires. Are they starving? And it doesn't, regardless of the path of humanity in terms of, catastrophic or existential impacts from this event, if you go back throughout human history, when people don't got food or water, they get pissed really fast. So and the weapons start coming out and people start getting really angry. So, that's when probably people are going to care. It may not necessarily be, we're angry about climate change. It's like, we're angry because I can't get any bread, or water, or, I can't send my kid to school, or we're living in, on the streets, or we have no heat or no air conditioning, and it's roasting hot outside and we can't afford anything. Everything's being turned off, so things like that'll drive people. And they might fight each other, or they might go knock on the door of their mayor or their governor because they're out enraged. So right. That's what I see happening in the future. I mean, human beings are civil until they don't got anything to work with, and the civility goes into the toilet.
Civility. That's one of my words on trying to stay in the comment section on that page. People to stay civil. It's very hard. I'm gonna Antonio, I'm gonna give we have just so many amazing comments, but we're going over an hour, and wonderful people. I'm going to have one last comment, and that was Alvin Johnson. So what are the avenues to demonstrate we don't need these things we are dependent on? And before we tackle that one, it's really maybe for another show, because there's so many things that have opened up in this discussion, and this was a good format. I'd like to do it again with both of you.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So what I'd like to do is, I think Alvin's question is very big, and it's bigger than we have time, I do believe, to do. I'd like to just ask both of you for a little closing statement, and thank everybody. And I'm thanking everybody for coming, because this was terrific. So I'm going to put you on first, Nicholas, and then Antonio, since it is your show, The Rising Tide. You'll close out. So
okay, thank you.
Go for it.
I think the most important thing people just need to remember when it comes to climate change is it's really as Dar Jamal puts it, climate chaos or climate instability. And the challenge is we've done as humans, and it's not our fault. We're born into this world. We're given the resources, the tools that were done before us, and the fossil fuel industry, even knowing the effects of it, gave us all of these tools to try to use to help build the economy and participate in the economy, even though they knew it would destroy us. But the reality is that there's profound changes to our planet that we've already committed to, but in this instability that we face, I think it's important to remember what's important, which is not so much about building the material wealth and doing all of these things that we've been taught to do all these years. It's also about really about doing things that take care of your family, take care of yourself, holistically, and show respect for the planet, which has been not something that anybody has ever taught in schools or anything. But unfortunately, if we had, maybe decades ago, we wouldn't have been in the position that we have to face now because of all of that's been done in terms of global warming, environmental destruction, and overall climate chaos. So that's really I can you can talk about data and nuts and bolts and everything else, but it's really about living your life to care about your fellow human being and your fellow plants and animals in the natural world around you. And I think that's the most important thing that we can do, no matter what the path lies in the next coming years or decades.
Well, thank you, Nick Humphrey, for that. I guess my closing words to our viewers tonight. How do we face catastrophe? How do we deal with what is coming when our best science now tells us it's locked in, we are committed, and it is inevitable? It's multi-generational. It exploits the worst of us, our greatest iniquities, our greatest inequalities, our greatest inequities. It pins neighborhood against neighbors, brother against brother, nation against nation. It challenges us and our very being on this planet. We're seeing many of the species that we grew up with destined to disappear and never to be seen by our own children. We're seeing the loss of the ice caps, glaciers, physical features of the planet, whether it be parts of forest dying for this or that reason, and it's starting to have an emotional toll on many of us. So one thing that I have always taken to heart that gets me to move, despite the enormity of the challenges we face, is that action is the antidote to despair. That it's very important no matter what stage. I'll take on this last issue of this debate that's kind of emerging. The issue is it too late or do we still have time? The naysayers say it's too late, and those who are unwarrantedly optimistic say we still have time. The truth is, it is too late for many of us. It's too late for the Bangladeshis. It's too late for the Pacific Nation Islanders. It's too late for many species that go extinct every year. It's too late for our children in a lot of ways to live the way that we did. But it's not too late to do the right thing. It's not too late to start trying to initiate change in your own life, in your own community, in your country. It's not too late to fight for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal. It's not too late to try to get the emissions down at Appalachian State University. It's not too late to try to do the right thing for our future generations. Thank you, viewers, being here with us at the rising tide. The tide is rising. Stay local, stay good, stay true, and we'll see you next time on the Environmental Coffee House. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Good night.
Thank you.
We'll do this again and we'll let you know.
All right.
Peace.
Bye, guys.
Bye.